and welcome to the Explaining Brazil podcast. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. The Explaining Brazil podcast that we're doing in partnership with the Brazil Office Alliance in this pre-electoral season. And as usual, I'm very glad to welcome James Green, professor at Brown University and chairman of the board at the Washington Brazil office. James, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. It's great to see you. I just arrived in New York yesterday for 5 weeks and enjoying the hot, humid weather of the city.
So, speaking of heated things, let's talk about Brazil-U.S. relations, because we got yet another interesting and baffling episode in this unraveling relationship this week. On Tuesday, the U.S. State Department revoked the visa of Maria Luisa Ribeiro Viotti, Brazil's ambassador to Washington, and then it rushed to explain that she was not being expelled per se. She may stay in the country. She may still act as Brazil's top diplomat in the United States. But if she leaves the U.S., she would be unable to return to the country, which is an extremely odd situation, to say the very least. And the reasoning behind it was openly transactional. The State Department said that it is a retaliation because Brazil is holding off the agrément to Daniel Perez, Florida Republican nominated by Trump in June, and a MAGA supporter. If Brazil grants him his agrément, Viotti's visa would come back. What do you say, James?
You know, why am I not surprised that something very stupid and incompetent is coming from the Trump administration on this matter? But I think the more serious thing is this is an example of an escalation. And there are clearly forces within the Trump administration or really seeking to create a rift between the two countries, to use this, I think, as a justification for questioning the results of the elections in October. And so, you know, not following any procedures, traditional procedures in negotiating with the country before an ambassador has been indicated, the fact that he has not been approved by the full Senate, it means that, you know, it's not even a done deal yet, because the full Senate might decide not to support him. He went through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So it's really, I think it's just another step in the direction of trying to totally isolate Brazil and then justify some kind of more egregious intervention or positioning on the part of the United States as the election approaches.
And one thing that is interesting, so for people who are not that knowledgeable about how these things usually work, usually a country will tell reservedly its partner country, look, we're looking to name so-and-so to the ambassadorship, and then also, behind the scenes, that country will give the agrément, which is the green light for that person to be named, the acceptance to its nomination, and to the fact that this person is going to come and be the liaison between the host country and the other country. The U.S. did not do that by the standard rules. It announced publicly before it ever said anything to the Brazilian government. So that already pissed many people in Brasília off. And what I've heard in Brasília is that the agrément would come, that the Brazilian government, regardless of Perez's profile, it wanted an ambassador in Brazil, because there are things that the relationship with the chargé d'affaires just doesn't cut it. It takes an ambassador to bring relations to the next level. And if that person is close to the president, that is even better, because that allows both sides to talk behind the scenes and know each other's red lines. And I mean, it makes the conversation more fluid. However, that agrément would not come before the election, because there is a perception, and I think that it's not an unwise perception in Brasília, that, well, since January 2025, the U.S. has not had an ambassador in Brazil, and now it's rushing to name one just in time for the election. And Brazilian officials are seeing this as a major red flag that, like you said, this is all part of a scheme to not accept the electoral results in Brazil or try to interfere in any way, shape, or form.
And the fact that they were sending two State Department members who were going to come in and investigate the situation in Brazil and possibly look, come back with a report saying that you can't trust the voting machines, you can't trust the process. It's all stacked against the opposition to the current president. All that, is clearly a part of this plan. And as you pointed out, take a year and a half to appoint someone. All of a sudden, you have to rush the next day to make that happen. There was no rush at 25 to have an ambassador. They could care less. It's really a part of a very systematic plan on the part of the administration to do everything possible to weaken the electoral possibilities of Lula so that he might lose, or if he in fact wins the election, to then claim that the results were fraudulent. And in talking informally to many people in Brazil, last time I was there, it's really clear that there is a very strong sentiment among Bolsonaro supporters to believe that you can't trust the electoral system in Brazil. You can't trust the electronic voting booths or the machines that they use, which is, I think, just outrageous. But it circulates as a given. It's a fake news story that is deeply embedded in discussions within the far right. So there is a base in the country to insist on this, which obviously the U.S. government and Flavio Bolsonaro are playing to this base at this point.
No, and the one thing that is interesting is that what the U.S. is doing is that it is making it politically impossible for Lula to give his agrément now, because then it would read as weakness. So actually, this escalating measures, they're just pushing the relationship to a point where any reset becomes way more politically costly for both sides.
Right.
Because then you're chickening out.
No, and that's the intention here. I think the intention is to cause a rupture. To say we don't trust this government. It's an extremist government. It's the whole issue of claiming that organized crime in Brazil are terrorist organizations is another part of this process. The fact that the outrageously inappropriate new tariffs on the country, which make no sense at all based on what was allowed and what was not allowed to be exempt from the tariffs. All of it, it's just it's an escalating situation, and I think that it's really important that people be aware of this, because I think much more is going to happen in the next 2 months as the October election day approaches. It's very worrisome to me. I'm very concerned. Although all indications in recent polls are that Lula is going to handily win. Maybe it'll be tighter in the second round, but that he's well ahead in the polls. And I think all of this is actually backfired.
I wouldn't say well ahead. I would say slightly ahead.
Didn't the Quest poll yesterday put him at 9 points? Am I wrong about that? Or
in the first round, but in the second round, the gap closed a little bit. So No, and I'm sorry, just to that point, but I think it's hard at this point to know exactly where we stand in the race, because last week was a week that was quite positive for Flavio Bolsonaro. He launched his candidacy in a formal way, so that gives anyone a push, some sort of momentum. There was the fact that the president's son, Fábio Luiz, known as Lulinha, became the target of 3 influence peddling investigations. So it's a Rorschach test. You can read as, despite all this, Lula remains slightly ahead, or that we are in that scenario where things are going to get way more volatile from now on, and it's hard to grasp the real state of the race.
No, I agree with you that I think, first of all, I agree with you that there will be if Lula does in fact outvote Flavio in the first round, assuming the dynamics, it's going to be much closer in the second round. It could be as close as 1.5 points, which is the concern I have, because in that kind of a close election, you can make an argument, and even though it's a false argument about polls. But I think also, I'm not sure how much Flavio really gained by his convention. I mean, on one hand, Milei was there, and that might have been really exciting to certain people in his base of support. I don't think that it really makes a big difference for most Brazilians who are not really paying attention, but it certainly didn't make him look good. And the other thing which I'm finding interesting, again, in my conversations with people who openly say that they're Bolsonaro supporters, they don't like Trump. Many of them just don't like Trump. They think Trump is kind of off his rockers. And so I don't know how much it helps Flavio's argument that he's really close to the White House and that he's going to solve all their problems, because they kind of look at the White House as kind of crazy. Again, I don't know how we can quantify this and what effect this will eventually have on the final results, because as you're right, in the first round, there are several far right candidates that will be taking votes away from Flavio, and then the tendency in the second round will be for those votes to either disappear or to concentrate within the far right candidate, and that could make the final results quite tight indeed.
No, and you mentioned Milei, and I want to bring this into our conversation because bad things happen in three, right? And Brazil not only is going through a rough patch in its relationship with the US, but also with two very close neighbors, Paraguay and Argentina. And in the Argentina case is the gravest one. Brazil downgraded bilateral relations to the chargé d'affaires level and will keep its ambassador to Buenos Aires in Brasília, and told the Argentinian ambassador that it will no longer deal with him. And that comes after a series of disparaging comments made by Javier Milei, some of them on Brazilian soil. So he was calling Lula a thief, a convict, a socialist trash. He described the Supreme Court justice as ball trash. And he kept on saying that after he went back to Argentina. And at one point, Brazilian diplomats said this is absolutely not the behavior of a head of state, because Brazil, despite the personal differences between Lula and Milei, was keeping the relationship intact. The Argentinian ambassador in Brasilia is a career diplomat, so it was possible to keep the diplomatic relationship untouched. But now it has napalmed that bridge.
No, and listen, this is again another provocation, and it's a la Trump. It's an imitation of Trump, just as Milei had his chainsaw and Elon Musk borrowed that symbolism. Milei is playing the Trump card, and chaos and confusion and saying outrageous things that are totally inappropriate and getting away with it. And I think to the credit of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, Itamaraty, which is, I think, quite cool-headed in this whole situation. It's a very complex kind of game that they're having to play, and they're trying to maintain a very long-term principled position of independence in foreign policy and kind of a neutrality to the extent possible on one hand, and on the other hand, trying to follow the rules, the way diplomacy is supposed to play out, which is obviously something that Trump ignores and doesn't care about at all. And Milei clearly is in the same camp. And that's the danger of all this. This is part of a desire by Marco Rubio and the State Department and to Trump, to the extent he pays attention, to really mobilize and to build this far right kind of coalition of governments that have come to power in recent years, as a bloc against Brazil, and I think against Mexico, and then finally to attempt to bring down the Cuban state. So it's a very crucial moment, and I think Brazil is trying to Minister of Foreign Relations trying to do the right thing within a very, very aggressive posture by the United States and by Argentina.
Now, to your Rubio point, so I said bad things come in threes. Then the third problem is Brazil's relationship with Paraguay. And that's on Brazil. Like the US is US provocation, Argentina is Milei's provocation, but the US was Lula putting his foot in his mouth and during the defense event saying that Brazil should invest more in defense, because we shouldn't forget that once Paraguay invaded Brazil, which is factually true, but it actually pours salt on a very open wound for the Paraguayans. So in the 19th century, Paraguay went to war against the alliance made by Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. And that war escalated to the point of total war, where on one side, the Paraguayan dictator wouldn't surrender, and on the other side, the Brazilian emperor said that the war wouldn't end until he was caught or killed. And that led to the Paraguayan male population being decimated. It is a big trauma to the Paraguayan people. So it was an unforced error by Lula. But to your Rubio point, and this is something that I found very interesting that nobody has talked about. But on the same day that that the U.S. revoked the Brazilian ambassador's visa, Rubio spoke to the Paraguayan president. He hosted the Paraguayan vice president, and the U.S. and Paraguay signed a nuclear energy cooperation agreement. And it is quite interesting that Brazil's relationship with some of its neighbors are getting rockier at the same moment when the U.S.'s relationship with those same neighbors is getting tighter.
And it's no accident. This is really a part of a strategy. I mean, it's very clear that this is what, Rubio and other people in the State Department and other advisors that are not in the State Department see about the situation, who follow Latin America. And I think, unfortunately, I'm not sure that voices in the United States, in the Democratic Party, are fully aware of this. I think, there's always been this problem of people really not paying lots of attention to Latin America, which some could argue is good. I would argue that it's bad because diplomats make very bad mistakes as a result of that. The way the United States misunderstood what was happening in early 60s in Brazil led to the military coup and 21 years of authoritarian regime. And it was, and largely because the United States just was capable of reading the reality on the ground and was misled by Cold War frameworks. And the same today. I think there's a framework that Trump has established. It's a very strange one. It's a notion that the United States has the right to intervene in Latin America and have dominance and be the hegemonic power, and includes things like saying, well, we might as well have Canada and Greenland as well and control the entire Western Hemisphere, or at least the Americas. So it's something very, very worrisome. And unfortunately, I think we're still in a wave of authoritarian governments in power in Latin America, or democratic authoritarian governments, which is not a good sign for people who want to see strong democratic institutions established throughout the region.
Now, one thing that is baffling about all this is that the possibility of this backfiring is immense, because that provokes the Brazilian establishment to stand its ground. And
Right.
I was talking to Supreme Court Justice this week, and this person was telling me if we sniff that the U.S. is giving money for the campaign of candidate, that is grounds for impeding that this person runs, that the party, because it goes directly against the Constitution.
Right.
In its Article 17 and 18 that talks about political parties, that political parties must abide by the standards of national sovereignty and must in no means have any support from foreign entities and governments. So, and the Brazilian Supreme Court has already shown that it is willing to stand its ground, whether we're talking about attacks from Trump or the Bolsonaro family. So I think that this is a warning shot from the Supreme Court saying, watch out, because you may be digging your own grave in aligning yourself to the U.S.
That's a very important point that you're making, and the United States can certainly ignore that as well. And I have no idea of what their exact plans and what they're actually implementing right now. But I think it's very clear they're going to go to the edge, if not overtly endorsing Flavio Bolsonaro. I think Trump is going to, in some way, say that, whether it's not explicit, it will be implicit, as a way of sending a message, which will cause international tension. And you're right, it's going to backfire to a certain extent. There's a sector of the society which is not happy about Lula's government, but they're not happy about Flavio, and they're gonna either stand out the election and not participate, or they're gonna throw their ultimate support to Lula because he's a known entity, he's a stable entity, and I don't think that's. I mean, Flavio is not, and the way Flavio has responded, some of the crisis within his family is an indication that he's not as reliable. I think there's another perception also that he's just not as experienced. That what did he do when he was in politics all these years? And that was the argument made about his father as well. But I think there is a sense that he's too young and immature. And again, that's not going to prevent his base of support from supporting him. But I think it might demoralize those people, and instead of really mobilizing, they might just go and vote, and then let it be that. So we'll see. I mean, it's going to be a very exciting 2 months. And I think as you wanted to talk a little bit about the vice presidential candidate for Flavio, I think it's again there. He's in a lot of trouble. Why don't you set that up?
Actually, before we do that, I just want to address something, and I want to hear to your opinion, because talking to people from the U.S. side, there is a sentiment that, and even with people that personally do not agree with Trump's move, but what they say is, well, there is a double standard from Brazil because Lula endorsed Biden, then endorsed Kamala. He visited Cristina Kirchner when he went to Argentina. So if Lula does it, it's solidarity. If anyone else does it to Brazil, it's interference. I think it's a valid point, even if I don't think that what Lula did has the same weight of what the U.S. is trying to do. But I do think there's a point there.
But
Lula
listen,
loves talking about other countries' issues.
He did, but he also didn't try to carry out a tariff war against the United States, or try to disrupt the American economy, or boycott the sale of beef or orange juice during Biden's administration to cause prices to go even higher. So I think it's just, one thing is saying I have a preference for a certain candidate. I'd rather have this person in power than this person in power. And the other thing is actually carrying out a very overt campaign, and that's what Flavio and Eduardo have done. And I think that's the big.
No, I totally agree with you, but I just think that when Lula says anything that goes through his mind, he opens a flank for false equivalences.
Absolutely, and I think that's always been a challenge in Lula governance, because he does speak sometimes his mind and then doesn't think through what that means, the implications of that. So we'll see what happens. But again, I think because Trump is so disrespected so much, and even in Brazil among the far right to a certain extent, I think the ways in which Flavio is going to try to embrace Trump, and especially even though the results of the American elections are going to be a week after the second round, 10 days after the second round in Brazil. So there's not going to be a cause and effect that things go bad for Trump. People will see that in Brazil. But I think it's really this embracing of the United States and of Trumpian politics is I think is not settling well in Brazil. That's my impression. It could be wrong. We'll see as opinion polls come out and as the election campaign heats up.
And speaking of the campaign, so Flávio Bolsonaro on Wednesday, August the 5th, announced his vice presidential nominee. And he spent months saying that he wanted a woman as running mate because he has a problem with female voters. If it were an evangelical and Northeastern woman, even better. And he ended up with a man who is battling statutory rape accusations. Congressman Alfredo Gaspar from Alagoas.
Why am I not surprised? I mean, this is again another pattern. And if we follow the U.S. elections right now, there's a congressman who allegedly mistreated his wife, who was the daughter of another important politician in Ohio, and Trump is jumping in and defending this congressperson. So it's not that Trump called Flavio and said, I would like to recommend this person to be your vice presidential candidate, but it's very serious. It's not a person from another political party. Flavio's had difficulty getting other political parties to clearly commit to building a coalition. So his coalition is a very narrow one. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a tendency after the first round for other far right candidates some of them to perhaps endorse Flavio, but others might decide it's better just to keep quiet right now and let him sink
Yeah.
and be separate and not be associated with him, so that that person can be a candidate in 30. And I must say that Michele Bolsonaro kind of performance at the convention and afterward has been extremely lukewarm, playing the card of saying, "Oh, I was preparing food for my husband," as if, and it's an inability to broaden out his coalition, which is I think going to be a serious liability for Flavio Bolsonaro in his campaign.
Now, one thing that is quite interesting, because I think that I do agree with you that the Flavio campaign uh, been has failed massively to draw support, but I also think there's a structural explanation for all this, because this is quite interesting that only one candidate, Lula, the incumbent, has a coalition of multiple parties. Everyone else has what we call like a purebred ticket. So both vice president and presidential candidates are from the same party. We had 5 coalitions in 2018, just 3 4 years ago, and now only Lula has one. And I think it shows, it tells you how parties are way more invested in the congressional races rather than the presidential one. Because in Brazil, parties cannot accept corporate money, they corporate donations. So the bulk of their money comes from a state fund that every year pays them, and roughly speaking, in accordance to their congressional benches. So it creates a loop that if you're big, you get more money. If you get more money, you can run better campaigns and then get bigger, and so on and so forth. And I mean, the Brazil's main congressional parties, they don't see neither Lula nor Flavio as strong enough for them to want to jump on their bandwagons before the election. Also because they know that if they get big benches, regardless of who the winner is, they will have to court these parties, and they will have to pay for their allegiance in post-election prices.
And there's another point you made about party coalitions. When you have a coalition with other parties, you gain a number of minutes in terms of electoral propaganda. So that means that the big bulk of electoral information will be coming from Lula's campaign. And I think we can say over time it's been fairly effective in terms of reaching a broad public. And we'll see what the campaign is like this time around. And it'll be much harder for the Liberal Party because it doesn't have although it has a large number of members of Congress, and therefore it's a large amount of time will be allocated for it. If it had added on 2 or 3 other parties, it would have really had much more significant time to reach the public. Although, one can argue that the public is a little saturated by these electoral campaign ads that are on TV, and therefore kind of tuned them out. But nevertheless, I think that's another difference. And speaking, I mean, the fact that other political parties are remaining neutral is not just a question of being able to negotiate afterward, but it's also the need to be able to win in regional and local elections by building alliances regionally and locally and different states in which strange bedfellows are together in races that don't align if that party is also officially endorsing Flavio Bolsonaro. So there's a way in which these parties want to remain independent, also to be able to guarantee that certain of their candidates get elected to governorships or to seats in Congress at the same time.
Now, when we were talking about the television and radio ads, just for people to understand, and I think this is quite fascinating about the Brazilian system, but you have a specific amount of time for all political ads. They will combine together. I think it's something like 12, 13 minutes in the afternoon and then in the evening. And it is also, just like the campaign money, split in accordance to parties' congressional benches. Now, like you said, these big ads that you have like a big program, Lula is going to have something like 4 or 5 minutes and Flavio a little less. These are the ones that people usually tune out because they're long, they're boring. But then the real asset is that campaigns are also entitled to mini 30-second spots over the day. And the number of spots that you can run is proportional to the amount of seats that your coalition has. So Lula is going to have way more than that. And this is the real asset because they just come as regular ads. So it's not like the specific time for parties where people just, okay, I'm going to have lunch or dinner while that boring stuff is being broadcast. But viewers cannot, quote unquote, escape these seconds because they're included in the schedule as regular pieces of advertisement. So they tend to get voters more off guard and be way punchier than the big television programs.
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, Lula has got an advantage in this way, and I think it will have an effect. The big clear part is that large sector in the middle, the people who are not aligned, who are going to vote at the last minute, who might tend to vote for who they think is the winner, whoever is ahead in the polls, a very much subjective vote many times for sectors of that part of the population that hasn't made up its mind. But and again, as I mentioned in previous of our conversations, I did this informal conversation with Uber drivers in Rio, São Paulo, and Belo Horizonte. And what was really surprising was about 2/3 of the drivers self-declared that they were going to vote for Flavio Bolsonaro, even though I didn't ask them who they were going to vote for. I was merely interested in who they thought was going to win the election. And overwhelmingly, 3/4 of more than that, I think, declared that they thought Lula was going to win. So at this point, 2 months before the election, there's a perception among many people who support Flavio that, like the World Cup, we want to root for our team, but we know our team's not going to win. And I think that doesn't mean that people don't vote, but I think it means that they don't enthusiastically carry out the campaign. Again, much can happen in the next 2 months. There's a lot of volatility that's going to be baked into the period ahead, and we'll have to see. I think, but it's interesting though. Even the accusations against Lula's son, I mean, Lula has said, "Look, if he's found guilty, he goes to jail." And that's not the way that the Bolsonaro family handles it. So I think the candidate for senator, Simon Tebet, who's is candidate for senator of the state of São Paulo, I think just yesterday declared that if there's guilt found, that he should go to jail. And that's among the coalition of Lula's electoral forces. So I think that's significant as well. We'll see. I'm not sure that's going to be a big issue at the end of the day, but it might explode in the next 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see a scandal after scandal between now and October the 4th, the first round. Now that the candidates are engraved in stone, that's when usually the big guns start being drawn, because parties can no longer swap a candidate if they become damaged goods. So now get your popcorns ready, because that things are going to get real from now on.
No, it's going to be a very, very significant period ahead.
And James, I think that's a wrap for this episode. We're going to keep monitoring the situation, and I mean, there is never a dull moment in Brazil. So next time we're going to talk, probably a new major crisis or new major scandal is going to be breaking. So have a good one, and thanks once again for this lovely conversation.
Thank you. I put myself on mute for a minute because a very traditional fire truck from New York passed by right in front of my house, and so I had to kind of blot the sound up. But it's been great talking to you. I think this is going to be an exciting 2 months ahead. I'm looking forward to the conversation with you to figure out what's going on and how we can make sense of Brazil.
Have a great one, James. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast.